I would like to ask you if there are any comments or questions from the last tutoring, so you can ask me for now, or if I was clear enough that everything has been understood. Your silence seems to tell me that everything was clear.
We understood, Professor, we understood.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pritika. Okay, I would say we can start. As I already said, the tutoring will be recorded, so I can't see any problem with starting. Finestra. Hey, here it is. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, Professor.
That's great. You can see that everything is recording. Okay, so I can enlarge it. Control L. Okay, and we can start. So everybody, welcome to the second tutoring for the Piranesi Rome 2024. This is going to be a little bit more conceptual, and I'm going to read a lot, and the slides will be clear with the written part, so it's going to be clear for everybody. The title of this lecture actually is part of a lesson that Professor Cagliari used to take, and the name of the lecture is Adrian and His Architects, 19 Centuries of Interferences between archaeological landscape and hypotactical structure. We can start with a strange and strong comparison. On the top part of this slide, you can see the plan of Villa Adriana with the coin from Hadrian, that is the owner of the site. Underneath, instead, you can find a plan of the center of Rome, and in red, the site on which Domus Aurea used to insist between 64 and 68 Anno Domini, so after Christ. Domus Aurea was the house of Nero, the Emperor Nero. You probably all know Nero because of the burn in the center of Rome, and all of the legend can be spoken about. Today we're going to speak just about the architectonic relevance of Nero and the fact that Hadrian's probably knew about the Domus Aurea from Nero that was a kind of 80 years before Hadrian took the power in the Roman Empire. So if Hadrian knew about the Domus Aurea, here you can see a reconstruction of Rome in the 4th century after Christ. What did Adriano see in Domus Aurea? With good certainty, he saw almost all of the building, the porticos of Via Sacra, the vestibule with the Colossus, the temple of the divine Claudius, and the pavilion on the Colle Oppio. He must have also witnessed the demolition of the Padiglione and its incorporation into the foundation of the Trajan Bath, because you know that after Nero's death, his building were somehow cancelled. And for example, the pavilion of the Domus Aurea on the Colle Oppio were turned into the foundation of the Trajan's bath. Adrian certainly did not attend to the settlement of the Stagnum already occupied by the Amphiteratum Flavio. What do I mean by that? You can see in this image in the image of Rome, you can see the Colosseum. Where the Colosseum is now, it used to exist a large pool, larger than the Colosseum, that was part of the Domus Aurea. And turning that pool into the Colosseum was with the Flavius dynasty, and the Colosseum was opened in 80 after Christ, so before the birth of Hadrian. If he was present in Rome between 82 and 96, he certainly witnessed the transformation of the Palatine Hill by Reabirio on behalf of Domitian, who in fact proceeded with an authentic and total refoundation above Nero's Domus Transitoria. So Hadrian definitely saw how Rabirio, that was the architect of the Emperor Domitian, turned the Palatine Hill into Domus Transitoria, that was the house of Domiziano. On the other hand, it is difficult to say about the magnificent and exotic 80-hectare park, close to the one of Villa Adriana, that is, it is difficult to know whether this had already been divided up or maintained by usum by Roman citizens. So we don't know if the park of Domus Aurea were kept during those years, because obviously, not being a proper building, to know how long the park used to last is not easy to be said. If the park were kept, as it is plausible, Hadrian must have had a very wide perception of the Domus Villa Aurea, which, while it was disintegrated in Rome due to the long wave of damnatio memoriae, was in the process of being resurrected in Tivoli. So the suggestion is that Hadrian saw the ruins and the rest of Domus Aurea left in Rome, and this idea was the starting point for the definition of a Villa Adriana in Tivoli. What we don't know, if the typology of methodology, let's say, of a design process used by Hadrian was already disposable to Nero's, let's call it post-Alexandrine drawing board. Certainly, however, the architects Severo and Celere must have possessed a special art and very little attributed to the Italian Mos Maiorum. The structure of the Domus Aurea can only be partially reconstructed on the basis of archaeological evidences, since many of Nero's structures constitute the hypogean substrate of a palimpsest, whose the main evidence are those monuments built right downstream of Nero's damnatio memoriae: the Colosseum, the Temple of Venus, the Bath of Trajan, the Domus Flavia, and later the Basilica of Maxentius. However, the resemblances with the paratactic dimension of Villa Adriana seems to be clear. The theme, therefore, is the Domus Aurea as an analogical reference to the Villa Tiburtina of Hadrian. Let's sum up everything of what I just read. The point is, we don't know if the Domus Aurea by Nero had already all the knowledge that has been used in Villa Adriana from Hadrian. But we can say that most of the peculiarities that we can find in Tivoli, in Villa Adriana, can be even recognized in the Domus Aurea in Rome. Despite Domus Aurea, when Hadrian gets to know it, was already being destroyed because of the damnatio memoriae, that is, that peculiar process for which the Romans used to erase all the memories of an emperor that has not loved any longer. We know that definitely Adrian knew it and knew all this knowledge as a starting point for the designing of the new villa in Tivoli. Here you can see some possible reconstruction of the Domus Aurea with the large pond. In terms of topographical positioning in the redesign of the city and the sequential perception of the compositional elements of Nero's layout, the strategy of grafting with respect to the cornerstone of power, in particular the Forum and the Palatine Hill, is extremely clear. On the one hand, the incorporation of the domus of Domitiano Barbi's family, so the Nero's domus, is still visible today under the stilobat of the Tempus of Venera in Rome. And on the other hand, as a direct consequence, the displacement of Sacra Via in the direction of the saddle between the Velia and the Clivus Palatinus. Lastly, the Colossus as a focal point visible from all of Rome and placed as a terminal of the perspective axis monumentalized by the large porticos and the site of the Sacra Via. So, Domus Aurea was a way to represent power, and it used to redefine the structure of the power and of the main and the most important part of the city in Rome, that at that time was the biggest city of the world. For example, the vestibule, so the entrance, according to this logic, acts like the great pylons of Egyptian temple architecture, freeing itself from the mos maiorum of the Republican tradition, where the public buildings of the Forum are located on the side of the Sacred Way and never in a position of absolute autonomy and perspective hierarchy. This was one of the main importance. For example, as I told you, the vestibule, that was Estran Point, had an important autonomy and position according to the rest of the composition, while in the previous example, the Romans used to not give a hierarchical positioning of the different buildings in the Forum. In fact, not even the Forum of Caesar or that of Augustus, already present in the monumental landscape of the earth of the city, were placed as terminals of movement and perception of power, because Nero wanted to focus the power on itself as the new founder of a new Rome. That is something that Hadrian somehow wanted to repropose in Tivoli. Here you can see, as an example, the position of the pylons that could be meant in the Egyptian architecture, something close to the entrance to the temple, exactly as Nero's did with the vestibule in his own house. Even here you can see the pylons, those two elements that can be recognized here, as independent and monumental element that let the people enter and define the entrance with strength. Here you can see some enlargement of the views. And here we can move to Villa Adriana. Actually, the approach to the Tiburtine complex is Villa Adriana, is different, conceived according to the model of the two famous acropolis of the ancient world, the one of Athens, but above all, that of Pergamon. The theatron, the theater, as the incipit of an exceptional ascending architectural promenade, together with the Templar presence and the large stoa, constitute the elements of monumental and sacral importance that mark the access to the urbs in Rure, which is the Adriatic Villa. Here in Villa Adriana, we can have some element like the theater or the presence of some stoa. The stoa is a typology presenting arches and columnade, are used here as a monumental element to start the ascension to the villa like a promenade architectural. And these make this approach similar to the one that we have in the Acropolis of Athens or in the Acropolis of Pergamon. In fact, if we want to consider the house of Nero as a countryside inside the city, with Villa Adriana, we can have a city inside a country landscape. The complex of the so-called Pantanello at the Basis Villa, at the beginning of the villa, marked with the Greek theater, this theater, and the temples of Venus Cnidia, temple that was insisting here, together with a large access portico constituted by the Pesile, reproduce the syntactic sequence of the theater, temple, and portico present at the slope of the sacred rock both in Athens and in Pergamon. Once the brow is reached, however, it is the Pergamon model that prevails with the sequence of different boundaries, whose orientation is geometrically managed by hypotactic polar composition depending on centrality of the golden square. This one is the golden square, and I'm going to tell you clearly later what hypotactic polar composition is. Here you can see the similarity with the reconstruction, hypothetical reconstruction of Villa Adriana and the plan of the aerial view of the Pergamon Acropolis. Here you can see, and you can start understanding what polar composition is, which were the rules that used to rule the organization of the Acropolis of Pergamon. In fact, as you can easily understand, there were two main focus points that organized the orientation of each building of the Acropolis. Obviously, these helped by the topographic situation of the hills. So, coming back to the comparison between Domus Aurea and Villa Adriana to make this big difference. The Domus Aurea, for its part, present a similar compositional attitude, but organized as on a general parataxis system composed on the basis of discrete and autonomous elements, a sort of powerful morphologically independent aphorism. So Domus Aurea, the one on the left, is organized by parataxis. So each element is mainly independent one to each other. In fact, the landscape, the landscape component that is established as an ordering principle on which all the pavilions overlook is very strong. And in the current valley of the Coliseum, the one between Esquilino and Celio, that is the unifying element of the composition, everything happens. In Tivoli, instead, the organization is of the labyrinthine type, where the sequence of pavilions proposes a paratactic continuum of introverted space immersed in the green landscape, but hypotactically dependent on some center, the most important of which is that of the Nymphaeum of the Piazza d'Oro. So we said that Domus Aurea stand on a paratactic system where any element is independent one to the other, with not a proper continuum. Villa Adriana, on the right, instead, is hypotactic. That means that each element depends on the others because of peculiar connection. In fact, in Villa Adriana, it's possible to proceed indoors, moving from the Piazza d'Oro up to the Canopus, passing through an intense series of pavilions, including the Imperial Palace, the courtyards of the libraries, the Maritime Theatre, the Sala of Philosophy, the Pesile, the Friedel, and so on. All of that without a hierarchical and capillary distribution system. That means that while in paratactic organization of Domus Aurea, there were a hierarchy between the elements. In Villa Adriana, each element, depending one to each other, are all posed on the same level, with the same hierarchy, without a scale. Here you can see the paratactic composition on a principal axis. Here you can see a polar radial hypotactic composition. Polar radial hypotactic composition. So Nero's, no hierarchy and independence between all the elements. Villa Adriana, no hierarchy and connection of all the elements. But the great generative force capable of nourishing life and the maintenance persistence of both the countryside in the city or the city into the countryside is certainly the water in its symbolic appearances of origin of the empire. In fact, the water is what characterizes both of the element, Villa Adriana and Domus Aurea. Just think of the constant supply needed of both complexes, characterized by extensive gardens and crops to be irrigated, artificial lakes, nymphaeums, thermal plants, and various settings present in all sensitive points of the immense topography of the two imperial domes. The one of Rome with the incredible pond of Neros, the big pool, the gigantic Nymphaeum, and so on. The one in Tivoli with great water architecture of the Pesile, of the Canopus, and the Maritime Theatre, the one that you will discover during the period in Villa Adriana, as well as the three thermal complexes. Water here are used for represent the prestige of the prince in a fully visible and transparent way. Whoever holds the water holds the life. An interruption of supply flows is absolutely not conceivable. Water must always be present. Water is life. Life is power. For this reason, the only chance of keeping the promise of the empire remains the connection with the large urban aqueducts, such of those, okay, I'm not going to list them. In fact, the presence of aqueducts like I told you on the first tutoring, is what characterizes strongly Villa Adriana, but now I can even tell you, do the same for the city of Rome and the Domus Aurea from Nero. But we already saw this image showing you how many important architects through the past learned by Villa Adriana and learn not only from the architectonical point of view, but as you can appreciate from what I told you until now, Villa Adriana could teach even some important ideas about the settling of a city. I don't want to talk about urban design or urban planning, but the idea that the way of settling and manage the relationship between the different buildings could be organized in different ways. Here you can see Richard Meyer, Raffaello Sanzio, Louis Kahn, Le Corbusier, Baldassarre Peruzzi, Giancarlo De Carlo, Andrea Palladio, and so on. So lots of those architects got inspiration and learned a lot from Villa Adriana. Here again, you can see the maps of Villa Adriana that I already showed you, the one from Giovan Battista Piranesi, that is the engraver that gave the name to our workshop. And those are some of the maps redesigned by other architects getting to know the villa and trying to study it and understand it. So even asking themselves which were the ideas lying behind the settling of the villa. Some of incredible paintings and some of them showing exactly how the villa used to interfere and model the landscape. Some elements of this pensionnaire taking part in the Prix de Rome during the 17th or 18th century, redesigning the ruins and then reproposing the project of reconstitution. That is a real project in itself, a project that could only start only if we survey and represent the ruins exactly how they are. You can see the amazing paintings. Somehow you are going to be asked to do something similar, honestly. We are not asking you to redesign classical architecture, but through the understanding of the original aspect of the architecture, we can repropose our contemporary one. Again, an aerial view of Villa Adriana. And here you can easily understand that the composition seems to be quite ununderstandable, quite obscure somehow, because everything seems to be random in a sense. Those are some images of the buildings, the presence of the water, the ruins, the relationship between the different pavilions, that without studying the place enough is not that understandable that much, actually. But again, water everywhere. And all the pavilions used to be flooded with water, using the water. This building is the great thermal bath center that was completely flooded by water. This is the Pecile. I don't even have to tell you. This is the vestibule. And Piazza d'Oro. Piazza d'Oro used to acquire water from underground to repropose large pools of the surfaces. All of this building, like this Nymphaeum, used to use water for the scenographical and also symbolic needs of the water. And as I told you, water also is the meaning of life, is the idea from where life is generated, so even the vegetation depends a lot on water. And those are images that you already saw and that anyway you will rediscover. And now we are getting closer to the references that were the starting point from which Hadrian started to design his villa. As I told you, the first one was the Acropolis of Pergamon, that is from the 263 and 231 before Christ. And this is the building that you can find now. This is the, sorry, just a minute. See, this is the Acropolis of Pergamon. This is the Great Theater. And this is the reconstruction, the ruins on the left, the reconstruction on the right. You can see already from here what I told you about Villa Adriana. Without a precise study of the situation, it's not that easy to recognize the settlement ideas that lie behind, underneath the design process. This is the reconstruction, the possible reconstruction of the Acropolis of Pergamon. And this is the image I already showed you. You can see clearly how this focal point organizes those elements according to these alignments, and the other focal point organize the other elements. Some of them are aligned both on the same idea. For example, this building is organized along this axis and along this axis. And this is a polar radial reconstruction and a polar radial idea to redesign a settlement. This could be something that could be used even now, because this idea has to do with focus, with the connection of different buildings. So why this can't be reused even in contemporary project? Here you can see the landscape reproposals. And then we can move to Egypt. Nectanebo designed this sanctuary of Isis on the Philae Island, close to Aswan, between the 285 and 246 before Christ. Here you can see the island along the river Nile. Here you can see how does this island appear now, after a process of reassembling. This is the plan, because, you know, this island went through a reassembling because after in the 50s, the dam on River Nile were built, or the island were flooded. So you can see here that all the buildings were completely covered by water on the floor plan. You could have swim through the buildings. So they decided to disassemble all the buildings and to rebuild everything on a closer island that was higher. But this possibility was due to the fact that they could have read the reasons that used to lie underneath the design processes. Again, a polar radial composition. So a polar point and radial alignments that define the reason why all those elements are not aligned on a straight axis, but they are all turning facing this polar point over here. We know for sure that Hadrian went to visit Philae Island. And also we know for sure that Hadrian visited the Acropolis of Pergamon. And probably visiting the Acropolis of Pergamon, getting to know the Acropolis of Pergamon and the Philae Island composition, he decided to bring back those ideas to Villa Adriana when it gets to redesign it. And now I show you what I mean. As I told you, Piazza d'Oro is probably the main center point organizing the rest of the villa. Here you can see a picture. Here you can see the plan of the ruins on the left and of a possible reconstruction on the right. The most important part is this pavilion, a very peculiar pavilion and very unused for Roman architecture, that nowadays look like that. We are guided to think that when the Romans used to settle, used to start on a classical orthogonal grid. So the composition of the Roman city, in fact, are organized on an orthogonal grid where the two main roads were the Cardus and the Cumanus that are crossing in the orthogonal way in the middle. Instead, as I showed you, there's this other way, not properly Roman, to organize the composition. So the polar radial composition, a pole from a starting point and some radial axis that organize the rest of the composition. Those axes, they can be afterwards the starting point for other radius to organize the space. So creating an organization that could be somehow infinite, exactly like the orthogonal grid. And this probably has been learned by Hadrian through his trips all over the Mediterranean countries. Okay, this part is something not that easy to be understood at the moment. Maybe we're going to speak better during the Premio Piranesi. Here you can see in a plan of Villa Adriana how the polar radial composition organizes the villa. In fact, all the axes starting from Piazza d'Oro not only found his central point somewhere else in the buildings of the villa, because you know that obviously you can find always a line between 2 points. But here, for example, these lines does not only connect point A to point B, but also organizes the direction of this building. We can say the same of this building, or even this one. A and B organizes the direction of all those buildings. Or in other cases, these axes keep the center of 3 very important elements, like those other axes. Here there are the name of the different elements I just told you about. And this is a schematical construction of what I just told you. Those are the element, the pivotal point on which those axes could be drawn. And those are other axes, as I told you, that could be consequential to the first ones. So even in this case, I'm not going to tell you all of them because it's kind of useless, but that can show you how this process used to work. Other axes, even some axes that can be reconnected, like this one and this one, can be reconnected with a 90-degree element. So creating a scalene triangle with a 90-degree element and isosceles angles. Another one is here. And so on. So all those schemes organize the entire construction of the villa. And this could be repeated and repeated and repeated for anytime you want. What this could be helpful for? When you're going to come to Premio Piranesi, probably the organization of your new pavilions could follow this kind of approach, using the same approach, and so keeping the ghostish ideas lying behind the composition of Villa Adriana. Villa Adriana and modernity. We found lots of keywords to define Villa Adriana. Villa Adriana is boundaries, is central floor plan, is offset of element. We found even the two kind of hierarchical reconstruction, that is hypotaxis with a hierarchical relationship, and parataxis without hierarchical construction. Water architecture, asymmetry or ponderal symmetry, circular boundary like maritime theater, iconic, syntactic, linear wall, and theater. All of those keywords can be found in Villa Adriana. Most of those keywords, can be found even in contemporary architecture. In fact, for example, this is a model, a diagrammatic model of a Villa Adriana. You probably can recognize the Maritime Theater, the Philosopher's Chambers, and the Wall of the Pesile. But if you go to the Vatican City, you can see St. Peter, you can see the Great Square from Bernini, and you can see how the Vatican rooms are organized alongside and with this polar radial paratactic organization, even in smaller elements. For example, this part on the bottom right is part of the Cortile del Benvedere that is over here, for example. Or in Villa Madama from Raphael, you can see that the composition is pretty similar of what we found in Villa Adriana. And we know for sure that Raphael, the designer of Villa Madama, visited and studied Villa Adriana a lot. So probably the suggestions from Villa Adriana entered the project of Villa Madama. Or even Villa Caprarola, with a central point that organizes the 5 geometrical elements all around. So redesigning this very peculiar architecture close to Rome. But even in the smaller elements, here you can see on the left part, the plan, probably you recognize it, of the strange pavilion in Piazza d'Oro in Villa Adriana. But if you look at this church from Guarino Guarini in Turin, you can recognize how many similarities you can find here and here. For example, the 8 curves that concur to redesign the plans, and even how this building used to appear. But even in the more recent buildings, this is the Vittoriale degli Italiani in Salò, the house of one of the greatest poet of the Italian 20th century, where the composition of the complex, here you can see, is organized by polar radial composition of the elements. So some poles, guide the definition of the rest of the building. These, you can see the university colleges in Urbino, designed by Giancarlo De Carlo. And here again, you can see how some rounded polar element organizes the movement of the other buildings. This polar element organizes this part, this polar element organizes this part. This axis is strongly connected with this element, so this element organizes even this part. And furthermore, you can probably recognize here the Getty Center in Los Angeles from Richard Mayer. Here is probably even clearer how the poles, the polar element, the circular polar element organize the rest of the composition. Here you can see some schemes that helps you in understanding this kind of, again, polar radial composition. This is also an elevation of the Getty Center in Los Angeles, in California. And we can even find some buildings that can be recognized even in a later period. This is a convent of nuns from Louis Kahn, somehow reorganized in the same way, the paratactical way of Villa Adriana. Or even this sketch of this plan that now is something closer, and this is a model from James Sterling. This is an intervention in Berlin that reproduced this kind of connection organized along those elements. Here you can see the plan, you can see the model, and here you can see the building. Obviously, this is a kind of a postmodern process. We are not going that way, or not that strongly, but here you can see that somebody in the 70s still used this approach. These you can find some project from Peter Eisenman, and probably through the lines you can recognize the paratactical organization without a proper hierarchy of element organized one close to the other. That is exactly what we used to have in Villa Adriana. That even from the iconical point of view, define circular floor plan as a very important element of the overall composition, mostly, as long as I told you, because of its importance in the polar radial composition. And also because the circular shape is so iconic and so easily be reconnected to the perfection that through the centuries it has been used lots of time. But I can bet that none of you usually design circular buildings, despite we have lots of examples of circular buildings. This is a primary school from Alberto Campo Baeza. This is another building in circular element. This is another school in Piacenza, in the north of Italy, close to Milan. Those are buildings in Japan for the celebration of Buddha. This is a museum, again, organized along this element. This is a research center from Tadawando, where the circular element has also an entrance underneath the water. And this is another building from James Sterling. This is in Stuttgart, in Germany, where the circular central point organizes all the rest of the pavilions around it. Again, something taken from ancient period and reproposed in a modern and contemporary way. This is the primary school that I already showed you, and this is the realization of this primary school. Here we can see the plan. This is the building from Alberto Campo Baessa, another building in the north of Italy, close to Treviso. And here you can see how strongly Louis Kahn took some references from the Roman architecture. In this peculiar case, we have the Parliament of Dhaka in Bangladesh that is strongly motivated by the Pantheon in Rome. And to close this slideshow, let me show you this building. The building on the left is an important pavilion called the Pretorio in Villa Adriana. If you look at the building on the right, is a church, again from Louis Kahn, and is evidently strongly devoted to the building he saw and he visited in Villa Adriana. Look at how many references, but if you would have seen just the church from Louis Kahn, probably you would have never thought to Villa Adriana, while we know for sure that Louis Kahn used Villa Adriana as a reference lots of times. Well, this presentation now is finished. I know that is pretty difficult and was pretty difficult to be followed. And it's not even that important that you understood everything. Obviously, you can ask me whatever you need and whatever you want, but it's just to show you, this lecture was to show you that ancient architecture not could be the starting point of contemporary ones, but should be the basis on which you can produce your own contemporary architecture. If Le Corbusier did it, if Louis Kahn did it, if James Stirling did it, if Alberto Campo Baessa did it, if Tadao Ando did it, why can't we do it? Some architects present it in a more clear way, other in a more transparent way that is not that evident, but all of the architects use the elements from the history to reproduce architecture. And this is why we love Villa Adriana that much, because Villa Adriana is not typological, as I already told you. Villa Adriana is shape in itself, is architecture for architecture, not that much depending on functions, but only on quality of spaces, or mainly on quality of spaces. That is why it's a great gym for all of you. So now, please, if you have questions, please don't hesitate. Everything has been recorded, so you can even listen again to that. But trust me, when we're going to be in Villa Adriana, with all of us following you, everything will be clearer. I understand completely that mainly the first part for you is very difficult. It's already very difficult for an Italian guy, an Italian architect studying here that has to do with Roman architecture so much. And they can speak Latin most of the time, so they can even understand some of the terms I used that for you obviously are more difficult. Maybe for students from Romania are not that difficult because they speak a language pretty similar. But for the rest of you, I understand completely that it's very, very difficult. Sometimes it's difficult, not sometimes. It is very difficult even for an Italian student that has to do with this kind of problem every day. But for you is even a bigger chance because exactly because you are not working with Roman architecture every day, this is a great opportunity. Anyway, don't get scared. Everything will be clearer with times. The important was now to start opening your mind to this kind of problems. And then when we're going to be in Villa Adriana, everything will be definitely clearer and we work alongside all the time, so everything will be okay. Do you have any question to propose?
No, Professor.
Okay, so if you don't have any question more, I could stop the recording. Okay.